Hello, Brian.
Hi, Woody. How you going?
Good, good. And you're well?
Yeah, I'm doing all right over in Sydney. It's pretty cold out here.
Yeah, yes, same. The days are getting shorter and the temperatures are getting lower. I thought we had a really interesting talk yesterday, and just we started in going in a direction which I thought we could explore further, but obviously I wanted to just keep it to a relatively short conversation last week, 20 to 30 minutes. So I thought we could do a part two this week. What do you say?
That sounds great. I'm ready for it.
Now, let's start with the market because since we spoke, gold's had a bit of a resurgence, hasn't it? Do you want to explain what's been happening from your point of view?
Yeah. So we saw the price of gold actually go up quite significantly after the jobs data came out in America on last Friday morning at 8:30 a.m. And I think gold actually jumped about $10 to $20 from about 1810 to 1830. The jobs data was such that the media expected, I think, 1 million jobs to be created over the month of April, and it turned out to be much less, something like 260,000. So that actually led to a loss of confidence in relation to whether the U.S. economy is able to recover without further stimulus, and it seems like there could probably be further stimulus coming if required, which is very bullish for gold.
Yep.
Gold continued its rise from last Friday on, and I think it's gone up about 30-40 US dollars an ounce. In Australian dollar terms, at one stage yesterday, Tuesday 18th, we touched $2,400 an ounce. And I think we're at about 23.75, 23.80. This has actually, this would mark about a 10%, almost 10% increase in the price of gold since its bottom in early March for Australian dollar. And I think US dollar is also quite similar. So we are seeing a bullish pattern being formed in gold finally. That is not to say that people should jump in head first, in my personal opinion, because we are still in the middle of May. And I do anticipate before the northern summer begins and the traders go on holidays, there could be one more hit on the gold price. And the reason why I'm anticipating a possibility is because if you look at what's happened with cryptocurrencies, they're actually down about 35%, 40% almost.
I was going to say there's been a reversal in correlation, hasn't there?
Yeah, there has been a reversal in correlation, but also my view is there's a possibility that cryptocurrency investors are actually jumping on board onto gold, possibly in response to like let's squeeze the shorts on the gold market. I wrote about something like this in the Daily Reckoning about 3 weeks ago, talking about how I think there is you could call it almost a siege on the fiat currency system that's surrounded, and to rescue gold and silver, which are currently suppressed in its price by the bullion banks. The cryptocurrencies are probably going to need to build the rampart, push the prices up, and send the investment banks chasing after cryptocurrencies. You can't really manage so many fronts at one go. And at the right time, push the price of cryptocurrencies lower by taking profits and push the prices of precious metals up in order to really send the fiat currency system look at like toppling it over, basically.
I know in your latest Rockstock Insider, you were heavily the way you interpreted the current financial system was pretty interesting, and you said there's big flaws there, and you brought up those job numbers on Friday. Well, can you just explain why they have such an effect on the gold price, or is it the gold price is interpreting weakness in the Aussie economy?
I think the Bureau of Labor Statistics in America has a massive effect on the general stock market. It seems like the financial world pauses to look at that single number the first Friday of every month at 8:30 in the morning. They want to know how many jobs, how many non-farm jobs are actually increased as an indicator of how strong the US economy is. That actually informs the trades on the equities market, commodities, precious metals. And the reason why gold usually responds quite strongly to it is that the indicator of the economic strength also is now going to imply what the Federal Reserve could do in their monetary policy and what the government could do with their fiscal policy. So it's a macroeconomic indicator. There are problems with that statistic, obviously, as most people should probably realize that the data actually has adjusted economic definition. The unemployment rate is not really about how many people are unemployed. It's actually how many people are looking for work but not working. And since I think the 1980s, the US government has basically tried to paper over the actual economic weakness of people who would otherwise look for work, but they are comfortable receiving unemployment benefits or I think food stamps.
Mm. But you say that from what I gathered from your piece earlier this week was that it all plays into an overall system that is getting too big for itself. Would you say that's a fair assumption?
It's not just simply about a system that's gone too big over itself. Is that you can only create an illusion long enough. It's almost like you use whiteout to correct your errors. But if you make that many errors, that your whole piece of paper is one big chunk of whiteout, everyone starts seeing that this is just covering over things over and over again. And I think it's not just the US doing this, it's the entire world following suit.
And it's had a big impact, that the resurgence in the gold price, on gold stocks in particular, hasn't it, this week?
It has actually been a very positive, it has had a positive effect on the gold stocks in the last week. But if you look at the bigger picture, since the beginning of March, the ASX gold index, I believe, has gone up about 18%. And certain gold mining stocks, even the large players, have gone up about 25 to even 35, 40%. So Ramelius Resources, for example, they bottomed out at $1.22, I think it was in early March, and yesterday was trading at $1.90. And you also have, say, Newcrest. Newcrest, I think, is up about 10 to 12%. Northern Star is up about, I think, 15, 20%. And Kirkland Lake, also another big player, is up about, it's actually up 30%.
So I know longer term, you are very bullish on the gold markets, obviously. And I know in gold equities also, but are you suggesting, what's your outlook for the next month or so? Is this a time to be a bit cautious in gold stocks, or are you going to be buying? Is it a buying time?
So personally, I am actually lining up to buy a bit more gold stocks, but at the same time, I'm taking a bit of profits on the larger ones because they've moved up quite a bit. I am expecting, as I had mentioned earlier, there could be a possibility that the gold price could be hit back down to maybe 1800 as a result of the central banks wanting to again assert control and keep that narrative that they're still everything is fine, and you can't have the central banks and the fiat currency system cannot have precious metals or cryptocurrencies showing the people that they haven't got it under control because the prices are rising up very quickly.
Let's bring in. Last week we kind of touched on the developments happening in China and the strategic moves the Chinese government is making in the specific region. Can we take off from there a little bit? So what are your thoughts on that whole? And I know you yourself were born in Hong Kong and you came over to Australia, as we established last week. So I'll be really interested to hear your unique perspective on that bigger picture story.
Yeah. So as a bit of a disclaimer to ensure that people understand, I do not have a unbiased view of the situation in Hong Kong, simply because it's hard to when you come from that country. So I'm on the I'm actually pro-West in the sense that I like the idea of liberty. I like the idea that people are able to live their lives and also have a say in how they're governed, rather than to have a central government telling us what to do. I don't trust the belief of that a small group of people can make the decisions on behalf of others. Now, in terms of what's happening in Hong Kong, I think many people are able to see that there is increased unrest and discomfort among the people with regards to the way the government is actually controlling law and order, because there's heavy dissension from certain parts of the population in relation to the national security laws that were effectively implemented into the region. Now, the national securities law is a very it's a broad-based, and I think you could say the measure itself is not very clear in its implementation, but the idea is for the matters of national security, certain opinions and certain actions cannot be taken by corporations or individuals, which could effectively just mean if you disagree with the government, then you are potentially in breach of this law. The way it works is basically because there is a belief, I understand, from the Chinese Communist Party, that they think Hong Kong has been, in quotation marks, infiltrated by the West, and Western governments have been using their influence on corporations and individuals in order to undermine their government in Hong Kong, which I understand that this is the way global warfare really works, is that you don't necessarily explicitly point guns at your enemy or at your opponent. What you do is you slip in through the inside, through money, through power, through the media, of course. And I mean, the reason why China knows this strategy very well, that it could be done in Hong Kong, is because they're probably doing the same thing everywhere else. And are they the only ones? Well, no. I think a lot of countries do similar things, as you see with various national media organizations. Even in Australia, you will have your local media, and you also have foreign-based media, and you also have foreign monies sponsoring local media in order to write things that would support them. So that's the thing that's happening in Hong Kong, and I think the Chinese government is trying to implement what they do inside mainland China onto Hong Kong, but people in Hong Kong are not actually necessarily used to it, nor is there a sufficient proportion of the population that even agree with it, because they've grown under the rule of colonial, under colonial rule by the British Crown.
But there's obviously like geopolitically, there's bases in Fiji. There's like an anchoring off the coast of Darwin. Do you think is there anything to be interpreted from that kind of global positioning, in your view?
I think having seen these types of developments by the Beijing government in purchasing assets in various countries, like key assets, it is a cause for concern for Australians and also other countries that have faced this same problem. Now, I think it's more of a problem in the Western nations because of a difference in ideology. You could say in certain parts of Africa where the Chinese government has been in there for about 20 years or so, developing their nations inside and owning certain key assets. Some of like there wouldn't be as much concern in the minds of the Africans who live there because they may share similar ideologies of socialism and centralized planning. But in a Western nation where you have a more, you could say, either liberal democracy or a conservative perspective in conservative or libertarian thinking, that actually means that they're going to butt heads, and therefore it becomes a greater concern when you have a ideology, when you are clashing ideologies, taking over parts of a country through asset purchases and owning key infrastructure.
Because there's no getting away from the fact that China is the biggest buyer of, or one of the biggest buyer of Australian resources and commodities, right?
Yeah.
How does that work? I mean, one of our, a friend of mine asked the other day, why would China, why would Australia try and offset its biggest customer, basically? What?
That's a good question. Why would Australia, would there be a risk in Australia upsetting its biggest customer in the resources industry and possibly in the real estate industry? Now, I would have a minority view, I believe, in holding this is, even though the Western view of the customer is always right, is what made the Western business and capitalist system so successful. But in certain cases, you have to actually piss people off. And what I found amusing, if I could even use this word, was when China actually, in retaliation to our government saying that there should be an investigation into the Wuhan in the Institute of Virology with its links to Dr. Fauci and also the virus outbreak last year. The Chinese government retaliated by putting on sanctions on Australian exports of red wine. They put massive tariffs, I think, on red wine and lobster and a couple of our Australian export goods, except they did not really do it for iron ore. And I read an interesting article on the Sydney Morning Herald, which I rarely read because I increasingly don't agree with some of the things that they're portraying. But this article was talking about how China actually lost in the trade war against Australia because they bought so much of our iron ore, even as they were enacting trade sanctions against us for what we have done. Now, China is the culture that gave the world the art of war. And I believe that military strategy worldwide, Chinese people have very good military strategy. Like they got a history of it. But the Chinese Communist Party has actually violated the art of war in many ways. Number one is, all war is based on deception. And what I'm seeing with China is when they threw a tantrum at Australia with that trade sanction, that actually showed me they were operating from a position of weakness rather than strength. Because if you are operating from a position of strength, you are going to cut off all trade, or you're going to create unbearable conditions on Australia across all fronts. You don't go and say, I'm going to stop buying this particular item, but I'll continue to buy this. And the thing is, what gave it away was, what does China need more of? Iron or lobsters and red wine? I think pretty easy to tell you, it's iron. The people don't need to thrive on lobsters and red wine, but the people, if they want to keep constructing across China, their infrastructure or their buildings in order to stave off inflation and to stave off the Chinese citizens from realizing this bubble that they're creating over there is to keep them happy, then you can actually see they actually played the game in a way, in a very clumsy manner. Sure. Australian winemakers. I got a friend of mine who works in the wine industry over in South Australia, and he said, yeah, we got hit pretty hard, but they're down but not out. As for China, if they stop constructing as they do, you will actually see inflation catch up onto them, and China is now actually opening a massive front of war, not just internationally, but they know that the domestic one is a massive one. Even the Chinese Communist Party is split inside them. You have the Jiang Zemin faction that is still clamoring for power, even though Xi Jinping is the current premier. There is actually a loosening of his power, and that's why he's clamping down inside the country and also doing it in Hong Kong. If you're a strong country, you really don't need to go and control your citizens, and you could say indirectly bribe them by giving them a stable economy, which is created on the illusion of fiat currency with massive debt, and also importing so much because you're trying to actually build your way out of the hole that you're digging while digging deeper.
Yeah. That's really interesting what you just said there about what the biggest concern for the Chinese government perhaps is keeping the people happy. Can you so is that where you think their biggest fear is? It's not necessarily what Australia is doing or the US, it's what their own people might be doing.
I personally believe it is. There was one stage where because the West was so hopelessly corrupt with the fiat currency system, that I was looking at China and Russia as a way to kind of like make the bastards honest, because you sometimes need an external enemy to do so. And I remember my mother used to tell me, you got to cut that way of thinking, because when you look at it, how many Westerners go out, like leave their country and immigrate to China or Japan or India, etc., as opposed to the other way around, where you have a lot of people who are in Asian nations immigrating to the West. Now, China itself, they have a massive immigration out of their country into the West. What for? Number one is because the people in there believe they'll get a better standard of life and perhaps some more less control in their lives when they move to the West. The other, of course, is that there are strategic reasons for it, because China sponsors certain people to go to other nations in order to learn what they have over there and bring it back to their own country. Now, China itself, the society, you could say it's like sitting on a sitting inside the pot, and the fire it's on high boil at the moment. Now, people are being persuaded that people who live in China, I know quite a number of people have the belief that, well, the Chinese Communist Party is doing better than the Western nations, because look at our country. We're developing, we're more stable, we can afford to live better quality lives. What's happening with the West? They watch on their own TV the US election looking like a sideshow. You're looking at European nations where people come out in the streets and protesting against the government, and they're actually thinking, we're doing all right here. But the truth of the matter is, they've been so used to not being able to go out in the streets to protest for fear that the government they can punish them with impunity. They only really start marching out if there's nothing to lose. And we saw some of that happen, I think, within the last 3 to 4 years, as the housing market in tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities started coming down. And you have developers who went bankrupt, state-owned enterprises also siphoning off a lot of funds. And these people, they know it. There are certain Western media that will portray the Chinese citizen as a very docile, and easily brainwashed bunch of people. Now, there are some who are, but there are a lot of people who aren't, and there is an increasing unease inside them, and that's also why the Chinese government activates its overseas activists in universities to suppress these opinions coming out, or getting their think tanks to go and speak up against Western, what they would call Western racism against the Chinese, is because these types of things are known, and they don't want it to actually flow back to the Chinese people inside the country to see what types of things are happening within their still iron curtain.
So it seems like we got this big overarching fiat currency system, and the Chinese government is and central bank is kind of manipulating it for their own means within China. On the same hand, you've got the Federal Reserve and the central banks in the US also manipulating the fiat currency system for their means. What brings it to an end? I mean, and what role does gold play?
Yeah.
Do you think? Do you think? I mean, sorry, Brian. I know it's a massive question.
No, I think
it's quite. It's an interesting juxtaposition, isn't it?
On one hand, one would say that it seems like you've got the Western Central Bank and the People's Bank of China, and you've got the Reserve Bank of India, etc., all enacting their monetary policy, and they're all doing the same thing in trying to use monetary policy and interest rates to control prices, to maintain a stable economy. But what if I'm to throw in the spanner into the works to say, if you have a bunch of people doing pretty much the same thing at a similar time, is it possible that they're actually of the same body? And I propose what would be deemed as conspiracy theory in many spheres of media and even in society, is that the central banks are actually pretty much one entity. They operate under a massive umbrella, led by, I mean, you have the Bank of International Settlements, you have the World Bank, you have the International Monetary Fund. They're supposed to be the backstops of the central banks around the world. Now, why would you have an overarching organization that looks after central banks in different countries, unless they're actually of the same feather? So while the US is printing currency to oblivion, they actually were responsible for funding China's meteoric growth, especially in the last 10, 15 years, because in the subprime crisis, the biggest buyer of US Treasury bonds were actually the Chinese government and the People's Bank of China. So you could actually say that this is like, this is basically them passing the potato around and playing this game of look here and don't look here, but they're actually all of the same. They're doing the same thing, but moving it to different countries. They're trying to stave off the inevitability of the irrelevancy of the fiat system. Now, hyperinflation, which is a dirty word amongst many economists, they try to avoid this by saying inflation kind of going out of control. They also hate the word deflation, so that's why they invent terms of disinflation. But hyperinflation is actually coming, and it's now I'm not scaremongering in using this. It's not happening tomorrow, but you can see signs of it when you see the stock market, cryptocurrencies continue to rise up.
It's almost like hyperinflation in assets, right?
Yeah. So when you have the CPI telling you that economic inflation is 2%, 3%, and yet you realize you got to work longer hours, you're more worried about your job as the years go by because you want to maintain your living standards. But the economists on TV keep saying, we're not seeing inflation. We got inflation under control, and you're actually slaving away trying to make ends meet. Where's the inflation? It's that they haven't really put it out there to you, but it's just basically out there if you know what inflation is. Inflation is not captured by one measure. Prices going up in the stock market, prices going up in the cryptocurrency market, prices going up in the commodities market, that's inflation. That's actually slowly bringing down the fiat currency system, even as they say they have to maintain stability in these markets to give the illusion to the general public that everything's under control because our markets are going up. They're actually killing. It's almost like they're using the same rope to try to rescue you while they've tied it to their neck and they're strangling themselves. So with gold and cryptocurrencies, I see that there is supposed to be a symbiotic relationship between the two, because with most commodities, the physical demand of the commodities does not really filter into the price that we see in the markets. Maybe less so in the base metals, demand can drive the prices, but precious metals, you can actually see a complete decoupling of in the physical movement and delivery of precious metals and the price, because the price can actually be controlled through digital contracts traded through the commodities exchange. So cryptocurrencies is supposed to expose the fiat currency system for how it's not working, because the price keeps going up for something which people haven't been able to pin the value to. Whereas gold and silver, the price seems to not be moving too far because the banks are actually trying to keep the price down through hedging programs with producers, through selling into the market in between the opening hours of the European, American, and the Australian markets to basically keep the price down and leave investors baffled so they don't actually go and invest in it. But eventually the cryptocurrencies, when people actually pick that up and when people are starting to use it as a means of exchange, then the fiat currency is going to start losing its value. China apparently is now saying they are looking to not just discourage people from using cryptocurrencies, but they're going to outright ban it. South Korea tried that last year. So everything's...
I believe India also tried banning it too.
Exactly. So something's telling me that if everything is hunky-dory, you don't need to go and ban things which look to be successful. You try to incorporate into system because your system is that good, you can absorb it. If you can't absorb it and you're banning it, you're telling me you ain't got control.
Yeah, right. Fascinating. Well, we've gone on for a good old discussion there, Brian. So I think I'll look to wrap it up. Yeah. But let's bring it back to the gold market where we started.
Yeah.
One of the things you wrote about in your latest monthly was the silver market as well. So that's obviously gold's little brother and or little sister as well. And you and you're pretty bullish on silver. Do you want to, just for a takeaway for readers listening, would you like to explain why, and then we can wrap this one up?
Sure. So silver is actually there is scarcity mining it out of the ground, in the sense that relative to the price, the gold to silver ratio is about 65-70 to 1. But you only get about 8 ounces of silver per ounce of gold coming out of the ground. Now, I know that people say there's a fallacy in that because there's a lot of potential recycling of silver and silver stockpiles in commodity warehouses. But I think that there is not sufficient demand in providing retail silver to the public because a lot of the silver that is stored in the commodities exchanges and dealers, they need to firstly be melted down and recast. And secondly, in the commodities exchanges, some of this silver is actually double owned, triple owned, and moreover, because of borrowing borrowing and selling for hedging purposes. So there is a huge amount of silver being moved in the commodities market to move prices, but the physical supply of silver is a fraction of that. And I believe there will be a time when you will actually see the physical demand causing commodities exchanges to say, well, we will have to settle in cash. And that's basically going to show the game is up. Now, it's been a long time that you've heard people say things like this and it hasn't happened. But the illusion can only last that long, just like in the Wizard of Oz, eventually they saw the man behind the curtain.
Right. That's a good analogy. Yeah, right, Brian. That's a fascinating conversation. I think we'll leave it there for today. Let's do this again.
Yeah, that sounds great. Enjoy the week to everyone.
Cool. Thank you very much, mate. See ya.
Cheers.